In Chapter 4, we talked about the inheritance of traits that were found on the autosomes. These were chromosomes number 1 through 22. We talked about autosomal recessive traits and autosomal dominant traits. But there are also traits that are found on the sex chromosomes, and they have different patterns of inheritance. So now we're going to take a look at how traits are carried and passed on if they are located on the sex chromosomes. This is chromosome pair number 23, the X and the Y. Before we specifically look at the X-linked traits or the Y-linked traits, let's review how sex chromosomes are inherited in humans. A female is XX in terms of their sex chromosomes. A male is XY. Because a female is XX, she can only pass on an X to her offspring. Males are XY, therefore they can pass on an X or a Y. If we take a look at how the inheritance pattern would work, we can do a Punnett square. For the female, we would put X and X for the two chromosomes. For the male, we would put X and Y. And then we could go ahead and fill in the Punnett square possibilities for the offspring. What we end up with, if the male passes on the X, then his child will be a female. The resulting offspring would be XX. If the male passes on the Y, then his child would be a male. The offspring would have the chromosomes XY. Notice that 2 out of the 4 possibilities are female and 2 out of the 4 possibilities are male. That gives us a 50% probability for a female offspring and a 50% probability for a male offspring. When we look at the inheritance of traits found on the sex chromosomes, we will always need to include the X and the Y in our offspring. So all of our Punnett squares are going to start with the X's and the Y's as seen in this one. Sex-linked genes are those genes that are found on either the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. Genes that are found on the Y chromosome are called Y-linked genes. But remember, the Y chromosome is very small and does not have nearly as many genes as the X chromosome. Traits that are Y-linked are pretty rare. The only one we've identified so far is an infertility trait that is carried on the Y gene. And you can see its location there, sperm development. When you have a trait that is Y-linked, it will only be passed from males to males. So fathers will only pass it to their sons. On the other hand, genes that are found on the X chromosome are called X-linked. There are different patterns of inheritance for males and females. That's because males have 1 X chromosome and females have 2 X chromosomes. In females, the X-linked traits act like normal autosomal traits. That's because females have 2 copies of each. 2 copies of each gene located on the X chromosome. This is the same for every autosomal trait. Females always have 2 copies. It might be written something like this. You always write the X, that's the chromosome, and then as a superscript, you write the allele. Here's an example of a female that is heterozygous. X big C, X little c. Again, notice you write the X and then the allele as a subscript. For males, X-linked traits act very differently. This is because males have only 1 copy of each. Because of this, recessive traits cannot be hidden. There's no such thing as a heterozygous male for an X-linked trait because they only have 1 X chromosome, and so they only will have 1 allele for this particular trait. Males will always get their X-linked allele from their mom. That's because their other sex chromosome is the Y, and they have gotten that from their father. When you write a sex-linked trait for males, you will write the X and the Y. Only the X will have an allele attached. It is an X-linked allele. So this would be X little c Y. The Y is left without an allele. We say that males are hemizygous for any X-linked trait. That means they have only 1 set of the X-linked genes. This word hemizygous comes from the fact that hemi means half. Males have only one allele for every X-linked trait. That will affect how they are expressed in males. You can never hide a recessive allele in a male. You will never have a heterozygous male. You will never have a carrier male. With X-linked traits in males, what you see is what you get. Let's talk first about X-linked recessive traits. How would you recognize them? What are the criteria? First, remember, the recessive allele is always expressed in a male. A recessive trait would be expressed in a female if she is homozygous recessive. This is the same rule for any autosomal trait. If a female is heterozygous, we would call her a carrier. This type of carrier acts the same way that autosomal carriers do. X-linked recessive traits are passed from either a homozygous mom or a carrier mom to her son. If the female is homozygous, that means if an offspring female is homozygous, you know that both her dad was affected because the dad passed on an X with the recessive allele, and her mom was either a carrier or was affected. If a female offspring is homozygous recessive, she has two X little c's. X little c, X little c. One came from her dad, one came from her mom. Because it is a recessive trait, the dad would be affected. The mom is either a carrier or affected. Some examples of X-linked recessive traits in humans are color blindness and hemophilia. Here is an example of a test they use to detect color blindness. Hopefully you can see the green number 16 hidden in this picture. Colorblind people of this type cannot differentiate between the red dots or the pink dots and the green dots, so they would see no number at all. Everyone else should be able to tell the difference between the green and pink dots, and you should see the number 16 clearly. Hemophilia is a disease where the blood does not clot normally. Let's take a look at a color blindness example. Color blindness is X-linked. That means only the X's will have an allele. It is also recessive. So here are some sample genotypes. A female could be X big C, X big C. That would make her normal vision. She could be X big C, X little c. That would make her normal vision, but a carrier. She could also be X little c, X little c. That would be a colorblind female. That is less common. Males have two genotype possibilities. Males can be X big CY, normal vision, or X little cy, colorblind vision. Here's a pedigree that kind of shows us how a colorblind male mates with a carrier female, and then we see several different offspring. If their carrier daughter mates with a colorblind male, they could then have another colorblind offspring. Here is a Punnett square for the mating that is circled. We see a carrier female, X big C, X little c, and an affected male, X little cy. You must write the X and the Y when doing the Punnett square for any X-linked trait. You then write the allele, big C or little c, as a superscript. The Y will never have an allele written next to it. The results for this cross will give you a 25% that it is a carrier female, a 25% colorblind female. For the males, a 25% normal male, and a 25% chance of being a colorblind male. Here's another example with the disease hemophilia. Hemophilia, if you are normal and you are female, X big H, X big H. Males, X big H, Y. Females can be carriers or hemophiliacs. Males cannot be carriers, but they can be hemophiliacs. Make sure you take a look, pause the video if you need to, and make sure you understand all of those genotypes. Here's a cross for hemophilia. Notice we have a carrier female and a normal male. Take a look at the offspring possibilities. take a look at the different probabilities for their offspring. They can have a normal girl, a carrier girl, a normal son, or a hemophiliac son. Pause the video and make sure you understand these percentages. This is a pedigree of the cross we just looked at. It's a very famous pedigree of a royal family in which hemophilia was extremely common. This is why we know so much about its inheritance, because it was prevalent in royal families. We see a lot of inbreeding here, a lot of consanguinity, which often leads to a high incidence of recessive traits. So take a look at this pedigree as well. Make sure you understand the carriers, the affected sons, and the affected daughters. It is possible for X-linked traits to also be dominant. The criteria for this: it would be expressed in a female if she is homozygous dominant and if she's heterozygous. That's because it is a dominant trait. If a male has an X-linked dominant trait, it usually will have a very severe effect and sometimes can be linked to a high rate of miscarriage. X-linked dominant traits are passed from males to all daughters, but not to their sons. That's because males pass on the Y chromosome, which does not carry this allele, to his sons. Here's an example of a disease called acanthagia pigmenti. This is a skin disorder. When this happens, males are often stillborn. This shows a 25% miscarriage rate that fits the Punnett squares for a dominant male trait. X, big I, Y. You can see it there kind of at the bottom of the screen. Your book also goes through an example of another X-linked dominant disorder, and you can see the pedigree below. It's also in your book. It talks about the mom who was a carrier but showed the trait right there. She passed the trait on to her son. Her son was X, big GY. You see him right there. Notice that he passes the trait to all daughters, but none of his sons. That's because every single son received the Y chromosome from the dad. This is a very common pattern of inheritance for X-dominant traits. Take a look at this pedigree and practice writing the genotypes for these individuals. Really quickly before we go, I just want to go through some hints to solve problems with X-linked traits. Remember, you always need to write the X and the Y. The allele is written as a superscript of the X, and nothing is written on the Y. See the following examples for females. Notice they always have 2 copies of the allele. Here are the examples of how you would write a male. Males always have 1 copy of the allele. The Y is blank. When you do a Punnett square, you must include both the X and the Y. Here's an example. When counting ratios of offspring, remember that XX are female and XY are males. When you are listing the offspring, the male and female must be listed. Here's how you would write that pedigree as a ratio. 1 normal female, 1 carrier female, 1 normal male, 1 affected male. This is a ratio format. I might also ask you for a probability format. That would be 25% of each. Probabilities can be given as percentages, 25%. They can also be given as fractions. So this would be 1 out of 4 normal female, 1 out of 4 carrier female, 1 out of 4 normal male, 1 out of 4 affected male for this particular cross, which is a carrier female and a normal male. Please take some time to look at the slides and make sure you understand the Punnett squares and how the genotypes are written. Also make sure that you understand the ratio and the probabilities for these different types of crosses.